يلا.
Okay, so hello everyone. Today we have our last session, last seminar of the Edu-BioMed series. And our speaker today is Nadine Modad. Nadine Modad has a master's in ecosystem management, and her expertise is mushroom biodiversity in Lebanon. And Nadine was part of the project. She initiated the process of documenting mushrooms in Jabal Moussa, and hopefully in the coming year or so, she will have enough information to produce a mushroom guide for Jabal Moussa. So Nadine, please, when you are presenting, keep your camera on. You can share your screen. And I'm going to turn off my screen and my microphone.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
It's clear.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Talho, for the introduction. So my work in the project was for the development of a wild mushroom guide in the Biosphere Reserve. And so I'm going to be at least scientific as possible, but I'm going to introduce mushrooms for people who do not know about these fascinating organisms. So I'm going to start with the morphology. So mushrooms belong to a larger group, which is known as the fungi. They, unlike plants, they cannot photosynthesize, so they cannot produce their own food. And they depend on organic substance to produce their own source of food. The term mushroom means any fungus which produces a fleshy fruiting body. So you have a lot of fungi, and then you have in the fungi group, you have mushrooms, which are the organisms which produce fleshy fruiting bodies. In general, most people picture mushrooms as the familiar umbrella-like structure which people mostly know. However, there are a lot of variations, as you will see during my presentation. So I'm going to, as you can see in this picture, just to brief you about mushroom. A general structure of a mushroom, which people know, is the cap, the stem, and then, but what they don't know is that underground is something called the mycelium and the hyphae. Hyphae is the individual thread-like structure. And then when they gather together, they form the mycelium, and it's like a heavy thread. So, and then mushrooms, they reproduce by releasing spores, which is equivalent to seeds in plants and flowers. But unlike seeds, spores are microscopic, and you do not see them unless they are in very large numbers and they create some kind of powder. So in this respect, the mycelium is the root of the fungus, and the upper part which you see is the fruit or the vegetative structure. The mushroom, what you see is the reproductive structure, and what's underground is the vegetative structure. So the fungal organism produces mushrooms that carry spores to ensure the continuation of its own species. Therefore, it's the reproductive organ for the fungus. So as I told you, these are the roots of the fungus, equivalent to the roots. And this is the fruiting body, which ensures the survival of the species. So how do mushrooms reproduce? In nature, as I said, they send a lot of spores. A typical umbrella mushroom, in a typical mushroom, the spores are born on the gills, which are the underside of a cap. However, there are a lot of variation to the gills. As a life cycle, so when you have a fruiting body, it releases the spores. And then when the spores reach a convenient or suitable substrate, usually when you have a dark area with good moisture and warmth, the spore will germinate. And then it will start producing something called the hyphae, which is like a very, very tiny microscopic root-like structure. And then when two hyphae, which are compatible, meat, they start producing something more developed, which is called the mycelium, as you can see here. And it starts spreading underground. And then it forms something called like an oblong structure, which is called the primordia. And the primordia develops into the fruiting body, which you see. So for example, this is a mushroom. This is called Ganoderma aplanatum. It's the artist conch. This mushroom releases a huge quantity of spores. As you can see here, even in the picture, this brown substance, these are the spores. And now you can see them because they are in very large quantities. So they can produce spores at a rate of 350,000 per second. And they do that for 6 months a year. So around 5.5 trillion spores. So you can imagine how much spores they emit. So most species appear in the late autumn when there's adequate rainfall and the temperature is at appropriate levels. Also in the spring, you have the same situation, but usually in the fall, you find more mushrooms than in the spring, especially that the spring season is shorter. So the mushrooms produce the fruiting bodies in fall before the harsh winter and in spring before the dry summer to ensure their survival and emitting the spores before these harsh conditions become prominent. But unlike flora, mushrooms are very unpredictable. So if you go to a location and you find this type of mushroom, you come maybe in a week and you don't find it anymore. And then maybe you come the next year, it's not there. So it's very unpredictable and it depends on a variety of conditions. Now moving to the biodiversity. After insects, fungi are considered the largest group among living organisms. And over the last decade, our knowledge of fungi has significantly increased. As you can see, I have put some pictures from my previous studies in other locations. We have the agarics, which are the typical mushrooms. We have the chanterelles, which are highly looked for and considered as a delicacy. We have the coral fungi. We have the jelly fungi. And scientists estimate the species number to be between 2.2 and 3.8 million, among which 120,000 are currently accepted species, which means only around 8% is known so far. The global assessment of wild edible fungi indicate the existence of 327 useful wild species. By useful, I mean edible and used for other purposes such as medicinal purposes. So there are 2,166 edible, 1,069 used as food, 470 medicinal species, but these numbers keep changing every year and even every month. So here you can see more mushroom groups. Here you have the bolids. Here you have something called the bird's nest fungi because they look like actually a bird's nest. You have the stinkhorns, which emit a very bad odor and attract insects to them so they can carry their spores with them. These are called the false truffles because they look like actual truffles, but they are not. Then you have another group of fungus, which has a different method of reproduction. These are the cup fungi, the earth tongue, the morels, the elfin saddles or the false morels, and then you have the flask fungi, and then you have the actual highly prized truffles, which we all know. So what is the role of mushrooms in the environment and why are they this important and why there are so many studies every year? So they are classified into 3 different broad categories based on their feeding habits. Most of them are, a large number are saprophytes, which are also the natural recyclers, the decomposers of nature. You have the mycorrhizal species, which are the symbionts, which grow in symbiosis with the tree species or different species or even flowers or shrubs or plants. And the lesser amount are the parasitic fungi. They are the least, the smallest group, which they feed on live tissue, not on dead tissue. Among the saprophytes, which are the recyclers, you can find mushrooms growing among the leaf litter on the ground, on the soil. You can find some growing on wood. You can find some decomposing dung of animals. You can find more also growing from inside pine cones. So they do not grow only on the floor. Moving to the mycorrhizal, the symbionts. Mycorrhiza is literally from the Greek word myco, which is fungus, and rhiza, which is root. So it's a mutual beneficial association between a fungus and the root of a tree or a plant. So what happens is that since the mushroom cannot synthesize its own food, it relies on its host, on its symbiont to give it the sugar it needs. At the same time, it helps the tree or the seedling. It gives it more resistance to drought, and it can help it get more water, minerals, resistance against disease. So that's why they usually rely on these in a lot of reforestation projects. When they plant seedlings, they inoculate seedlings with the mycelium of these mycorrhizal mushrooms, so that the seedlings have a better chance to survive than without a symbiont. The parasitic fungi, some of them grow on host trees, like this Armiralia fungus, which is called the honey fungus, and causes a lot of destruction in Europe of a lot of trees. And it causes the white rot in the tree and eventually the death. And you also have parasitic fungus which grows on insects or larvae, as this one. And you will see later that these are entomophagous fungi, which means it feeds on insects. Some of them are also medicinal. Moving to the history and culture of mushrooms. So I think a lot of people are fascinated by these organisms since a very long time. People could not explain the apparent sudden of mushrooms. They often linked it with various phenomena like lighting, traces, footsteps of witches, evil actions. Such attitudes persisted among people well into the 19th century, but the scientific community eventually recognized that mushrooms represent a life form comparable to plants. So Egyptians, for example, prized mushrooms very highly and thought them to be plants of immortality. Pharaohs were so intrigued by the delicious flavor that they declared them only for royalty. Ancient Greeks and Romans prized truffles as well as mushrooms. They believed that they were formed during thunderstorms and that they were referred to as food of the gods. As you can see in this picture, this is actually called a fairy ring. Because they usually appear suddenly, and they always appear in a ring because the mycelium, which is on the ground, grows in a consistent outwards manner. And then when the right environment sets in, it produces the fruiting body at the edge of the mycelium, creating something which they call the fairy ring. In Asian cultures too, they have a traditional appreciation of wild mushrooms. They have used them for culinary, medicinal, nutraceutical, and even aphrodisiacal purposes. So many superstitions over the year were associated with mushrooms. Some are harmless, but some are dangerous. It takes a great deal of education and experience to safely collect edible mushrooms. There are sayings such as there are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old bold mushroom hunters, which means if you are bold, you might end up dying. And then there's also a well-known saying which says, when in doubt, throw it out. This is what I always repeat to people. Whenever you have 1% probability or chance that you have a doubt about this specimen, do not eat it and just discard it. According to Fau and Aurora, usually the poorer the people, the more likely they are to use wild edible fungi. Some traditions are lost as people become better educated and live away from the land, and they show an increased reluctance to eat all but the common species. But in countries such as Korea, China, Russia, and Japan, the tradition of eating wild edible fungi is much stronger and still going on more than other places. So what are the culinary values of mushrooms? So as we said, some are easy to identify, others mimic non-toxic varieties. Some mushrooms can make you ill while others are fatal and you could die from them. So they are distributed into edible fungi which do not affect human health at all when consumed. There are the uncertain species which when eaten cause some disorder to the health, but the severity of the symptoms varies from case to case or from person to person. And there are numerous lookalike mushrooms and these can be easily confused. And there are the poisonous ones, which a lot of poisonous mushrooms, they do not generate symptoms right after their consumption, but it takes a bit of time. And by then the poison would have entered the bloodstream and created a lot of damage like kidney damage, liver damage, and some other irreversible damage. This is why it's critical to immediately seek medical advice after every hour after ingestion counts whenever you have any type of symptoms. So when poisoning is suspected, people should try to induce vomiting, try to keep some vomit when they go to the hospital so that the toxicologist can try to identify the toxin, record the details of the development of the symptoms, such as, for example, other than vomiting, if there's diarrhea, there's stomach aches, there's shivering, whatever. And always keep a sample of the specimen so that the toxicologist and the specialist can identify it properly for the proper treatment. So I always advise people when they tell me that they forage mushroom is to never eat a wild mushroom raw. Even some wild mushrooms, when eaten raw, they can cause some stomach upset. Try only one species at a time and wait at least 24 hours before eating another. Do not overeat. Save at least 2 good specimens for the toxicologist in case something happens. When collecting, use a separate container for each species and do not serve wild mushrooms to the very young or the very old. Some common myths about the edibility of mushrooms, like poisonous mushrooms can tarnish a silver spoon. When cooked with rice, it will turn the rice yellow or blue. Mushrooms can be made safe by parboiling. They cannot, poisonous mushrooms cannot be peeled. Cooking with pears renders them safe. So there's a lot of myths which people need to be aware of. So accurate determination and proper identification of a species is the only safe way to ensure edibility and the only protection against possible accidents. So there are the medicinal mushrooms. I don't know if some of you heard about something called the Reiki. Reiki is a polypore which grows on dead trees. It's a Ganoderma species. It's a medicinal mushroom and it's among the most famous ones worldwide. They extract a lot of medicinal properties from it. It is said that it increases immunity, it helps to fight inflammations. There's a lot of issues that it is anti-cancerous, it is full of antioxidants. So it's very well known. And so many of the common edible species have therapeutic properties as well. This one is not edible because it's very tough, but there are edible ones which are also medicinal. And it is estimated that the total number of useful fungi to be over 2,300 according to FAO. There's another medicinal mushroom also famous, which is called the cordyceps. It's an entomophagous fungi, which means it feeds on insects or the larvae of insects. So for example, these ones are larvae which are underground. The spore infects them and then it creates this fruiting body. And people use this in especially Chinese to create pills, teas, and other sorts of medicines. And it's also reported to be very, very beneficial medicinally wise. So moving to what I did in Jabal Moussa. So we did a joint research for the wild mushroom inventory in Jabal Moussa with USG. So it was a common project between AUB and USG. But USG also tackled the Shuf Biosphere Reserve as well. They had 2 teams. One was in Jabal Moussa and one is in Shuf Biosphere Reserve. And this was done at USG under the supervision of Dr. Magda Boudagher. So the methodology of the work in Jabal Moussa was coordinated by myself and by Rami Azar from USG. Most visits were communicated with the USG team as well to try to cover as many trails as possible and not to overlap during the same week. So the methodology mostly consisted of surveying trips and field observations, laboratory work when needed, microscopic and macroscopic. Sampling for DNA barcoding and molecular identification was also done at the laboratory for the USG team. Trails and off-trail were covered when possible. In my case, I managed to do 10 trips during these 2 years, and I managed to document 78 specimens for Jabal Moussa. And maybe I could have done more trips, but because of the situation in the country and the COVID and the road closures, I couldn't do more than that. Plus the weather also did not help much. Some trails, I noticed that some trails such as Trail 15 and 11 were found to be most prolific in Jabal Moussa. And they were among the trails which we covered more than once during the same season. The findings will be put together in one common database between the two universities. So these are some pictures from the field during my collection. And I covered basically 2 seasons, 2 years, the fall and the start of the winter from the 2 years and the spring season as well. So I used I always geotagged my specimens, and I had proper identification pictures, full description, as well as any important notes like the tree it was growing under, the weather, how it was, and if it was growing in quantity or they were very rare, and if there was even animal foraging, which I noticed could have reduced the specimens that we observed. So I looked about mushroom field guides in general. And so a good field guide is a reliable roadmap to any mushroom work. The most well-researched mushrooms, according to the research I did, included something called the David Aurora's Mushroom Demystified, which I heavily used during my master's thesis, the Complete Mushroom Hunter Guide, the North American Mushroom Field Guide. So there are several. So, and in all of them, safety is always emphasized in addition to other aspects, like the general morphology of the mushroom, their importance in the environment, and the conservation measures that they usually do for the future. So these are examples of some small guides about mushrooms. Like this is the content of one of them, what they usually put. I'm going to tweak it a bit for Jabal Moussa, of course, because when you're talking about a big area, it's different when you're or a country or a state is different than when you're talking about a small reserve. So these are some examples, like what they usually put, how they describe species in the field guides. Usually they target the general audience, so they don't go in a lot of details. Since for Jabal Moussa, the audience is not from the field, I will try to have the field guide produced in a way that it is not complicated and there's not a lot of complicated scientific terms. This is another one. So you can see there are very general descriptions and they do not go into a lot of details. So what I'm thinking is, so the main aim of our field guides is to increase the knowledge of the fungal diversity, learn more about the habitat preferences and geographic distribution of the different mushrooms in the reserve. The guide will not only include the different species found, their description and other important information, but will also create a specimen distribution map and most importantly, awareness and conservation measures. So I'm thinking of it will include something about the general mushroom group I documented, general description, the number of species found, for example, for the bracket fungi. Then I'm going to put something similar to this, one or two representative pictures which make it easy to identify them. The scientific name, the common name, if there is, the French name also if it's available. Description, the whole structure of the specimen, the dimensions, the occurrence, the trail, the date, the habitat, under which type of trees or microclimate or ecosystem, the ecology, if it's saprophytic or mycorrhizal or parasitic, the GPS, of course, the edibility, and additional comments which I might find useful. Like, for example, some of them have very specific odors. Or if you cut them, they bruise and they give you a color, or they emit a type of latex. So this is another group like the puffballs and the earth stars, same thing, description and the relevant picture. The agarics, which is among the biggest groups, and usually this is the largest group whenever I do any study. Like, for example, the Hygrophorus rusula and the description. For example, the Hygrophorus rusula, this one is mycorrhizal, mostly with hardwoods, and usually it's associated with conifers, and it's edible. So conservation and ethics, which is the last part of my presentation, and which I always emphasize. The collection method can negatively affect both mushroom populations and collectors. For this reason, the following rules should always be followed. Only edible mushrooms should be collected, and as such should be considered the mushrooms that are traditionally collected. Experiments like and speculations like edible mushrooms are those which are affected by worms, or mushrooms that produce a milky liquid that when cut are poisonous, are very dangerous and can be very fatal. Only mature fruiting bodies that have already given out their spores for reproduction should be collected. The young, unripe mushrooms should be left intact. Over-harvesting raises concern to possible damage to fungal resources and causes long-term effect over the mushroom population, because you are harvesting the immature bodies and you are reducing the spore populations and hence the ability of the mushroom to reproduce. The removal of organic matter should be avoided because this will result in drying the mycelia, exposing it to the sun and the air, and mushrooms should be carefully removed either by cutting them off with a small knife or just by moving them back and forth and creating as least damage and disturbance as possible. The use of a rake to remove organic matter of a large area is very dangerous and very critical, because in this way, the reproduction process of the mushroom is disturbed. And in Lebanon, a lot of people do not adopt any of these recommendations, because whenever they see any mushroom, they just dig it or dig several, and they just start taking pictures, and then they just dig them out for pictures, and they just let them be, even the immature ones. So they're just very fascinated by these organisms, and then they want to show the people that look what I found, look what I found. But what they don't know is that they are damaging the very delicate mushroom reproduction process and the ability of the mushroom to reappear the next year. So the way forward, in my opinion, is we have to avoid disturbance of mushroom habitats and, of course, handling them correctly. The key to their protection lies in understanding the natural environment and requires both research and continuous training. There must be awareness campaigns planned, and people should know the importance of mushrooms in the environment, the foraging hazards, and the need for conservation. Further research can also be done, including using mushroom populations as bioindicators of climate change. And mushroom studies should be a continuous work, and this could be perhaps linked to the Citizen Science Act, which the project also started, and this could be further possible collaboration in the future. A complete coverage of the mushrooms in Jabal Moussa, as I said, requires continuous work. More and more species will be found every year. given that different species have different requirements for fruiting, all species in an area do not fruit at the same time. Thus, when studying the mushroom flora of a region, we must collect in all habitats repeatedly over a number of years in different seasons in order to make a reasonably comprehensive survey. As once expressed, hunting mushrooms is a never-ending game of poker. I'd like to end my presentation with a very old saying, which I always repeat. Nature alone is antique and the oldest art a mushroom. By this, you can tell how much I'm still fascinated about mushroom. I've been studying them since 2003, but I'm still fascinated. Like every time I find a specimen, it's like it's the first time I find a mushroom. So it's a passion for me. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for this very exciting and interesting presentation. And I'm going to ask if anyone from the audience has questions. Actually, I have a question specifically for Jabal Moussa about, you said that there were specific trails that were richer in mushrooms, or at least that you have found had more the diversity of mushrooms. Do you think it is possible to actually organize like mushroom walks during the fall, like have specific activity related to mushroom walks in the fall?
Yes, of course, but I think this should be done once the guide is out, so that people can have the guide with them, and whenever a specimen is found, they can try to identify it and see the different information about it. And if not, then I mean, it should always be done. Maybe even the people in Jabal Moussa could be given trainings about the different types of mushrooms, so that when they are having their walks and they encounter some sorts of mushrooms, they can at least identify the groups and tell the people the different, the interesting information, what they do in the environment, and the importance of not to overforage and to respect the mushrooms as they are.
So at least we have one trail that we can work on. You said trail 11 and 13.
There are at least 3.
Yes, so we can at least, we can think of maybe providing training or involving people to guide mushroom walks on these 3 trails, since the bulk of the species have been identified, right?
Yes, of course.
So you have a question from Hestia Aii. Will you do a collaborative scientific projects?
What do you mean, Hestia?
I mean, I don't know if you hear about Terra Botanica, when they,
No.
for example, oh, okay. So say they are doing seminars, and then people that are not from a scientific background can collaborate and give informations about plants that they are they found in the nature.
So they call upon people from the field to give like seminars to the people, right?
Yes, and the people that did the seminar will collaborate with the scientific by providing informations.
Okay. What is it called again? Can you write it?
I know the French term of it, un projet de sciences collaborative.
Okay. No, I'm not aware of it actually. But I'm always willing to collaborate, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hestia. Any other questions or other comments? Other suggestions?
Hello, everyone. Tanya Ballan from Jabal Moussa. Thank you. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask, please, when the guide would be available. You were saying that a guide with the mushroom species would be available. Is it right?
Yes, this needs to be collaborated with Jabal Moussa about the details and all the information. So this needs to be collaborated with you actually.
Okay.
So we'll be communicating you soon. Communicating with you soon on that.
Perfect. And if we do like an event, a special event that hikers can come and walk and collect, not collect, of course, but see the mushrooms, would you be like interested to walk with a group of hikers yourself? Is it
Yes,
possible?
of course, because I'm always trying to let people know about the importance of these organisms and how critical they are for the environment and for the humans as well. So, and I would like to always pinpoint to people the damages when they forage for no reason or when they damage the habitat of the mushrooms, even when they're having hikes. There sometimes there's damage done by hikers. So this way, maybe I can also help reducing this damage and making people more interested and maybe take more pictures and upload it to the citizen science app so we have more mushrooms, because I'm only one person, and even if I'm going to Jabal Moussa every week, maybe from one day to the other more mushrooms will appear and I'm not there. So the more people you have involved, the more species you might find. So involving people is a very good option for that respect.
Okay, thank you.
I think Nadine raised a very important point, is that in this project with the Edu-BioMed, we were able to start the process of documenting mushrooms and establish a solid relationship with the Jabal Moussa management team, and to develop a citizen science app. So what we need to do now is to benefit from all these outcomes of the project, to continue to sustain the work and the relationship. So probably the first thing that we need to do is upload a citizen science project on the Edu-BioMed app, and then together between the AUB NCC and the Jabal Moussa, start disseminating in the fall, asking people to document, and even in the spring, Nadine, it's possible now.
Yes, right.
To ask people to document any mushroom that they see, and then it becomes easier for Nadine to curate. Yani if there are images uploaded by visitors, by the management team, then it becomes easier for Nadine to identify and to document, because the bulk of the work is to do the field work. And as she said, being one person is not simple. So I think what we're going to do, the first thing we're going to do is work together with you, Tanya, with your team, to put on the Edu-BioMed citizen science app, to put a project and invite any visitor to upload any photo of a mushroom. And that will help us a lot to move forward with collecting the necessary data to produce the guide.
Okay, great. Clear. Thank you so much.
So if anyone else has any comments or any questions? Okay, so if there are no comments and questions, I would like to thank you all for attending. This is our last Edu-BioMed seminar series. I thank those who were consistent in attending. Those who missed our seminars, they are all recorded and they are present on our project YouTube page. And I think it would be interesting to go over them in case you are, you feel like you want to know what we have done during this period. And so thank you all, and we will be in touch at least in person to follow through on the different projects that we started with the Edu-BioMed. Thank you all.
Thank you.